The Middle Ages is a largely unknown and foreign country to many people. Even the name Middle Ages that we use to refer to this time period is itself a dismissive term, coined to express a sort of barrenness, a dull period that lasted between the grandeur of classical civilization and the modern era. I'm not even going to mention, much less use, the horrid term Dark Ages. We have to transcend the rhetorical baggage that these terms were originally coined to express. Well, for the next 12 lectures, we're going to visit the Middle Ages and examine that period's substantial contributions to the history of science. The one thing I should say before launching into the Middle Ages is that there is one particular theme that will recur constantly in medieval culture, recur constantly in these lectures, and that is the pervasiveness of monotheistic religion. Monotheistic religion is the foundation for the two cultures of the Middle Ages that we're going to examine, the Christian Europe and the Islamic world. And so these 12 lectures will be divided between those two cultures, the two great monotheistic world religions, Christianity and Islam. I should say a little something about monotheism itself, because it does, in a sense, undergird some of our principles of science. And what I mean by that is this, that if we conceive of the world as governed serenely by a single omnipotent God who created everything that exists, then that presumes that there is a constancy, a stability to nature, allowing us to talk about natural laws, for example, and that causes always produce the same effects, and that sort of thing. A capricious world that has Olympian gods quarreling and constantly intervening in the running of the world or arguing with each other is inimical to the ideas of the stability of nature that's essential for natural science. One other thing before we get into the Middle Ages, and that's the issue of science and religion and what their relationship is. That relationship is very complex, and I really don't have time to talk about it as a relationship itself during these lectures. Instead, what I'm going to do is allow the material to speak for itself. And by the end of the 12 lectures, I hope you'll have a good appreciation of part of the relationship between science and religion, at least in the Middle Ages. I'll only remind you of what I said in the first lecture, and that was that there are really no historians of science today, no serious historians of science today that buy into the old thesis of warfare or conflict between science and religion. Instead, we try to have a more nuanced view of the relationship. Well, let's begin then with early Christianity. Now, Christianity developed within pagan culture, within the Roman Empire. In the very early years of Christianity, there was really quite very little interaction on an intellectual level between Christians and pagans. But that would soon change, because by the middle of the 2nd century, not only were more and more intellectuals becoming Christians, that is, intellectuals who demanded a more intellectual approach to religion, but also Christianity itself had developed certain sects that were disagreeing with one another, and so there needed to be a more rational, more intellectual approach to the faith. Where do you get these kind of tools for rational argument, for biblical exegesis, for rhetoric, all these kinds of qualities that were needed in the middle of the 2nd century? Well, pagan philosophy had developed them to a very high degree. And so many Christians have started availing themselves more and more of pagan culture. The phrase Athens and Jerusalem is often used to sum up what the relationship between pagan culture and Christianity was at the time. And the phrase comes from a rhetorical question that was posed by the writer Tertullian. Now, Tertullian was born about 155, died around 230, we don't know his exact dates. He asked, what has Jerusalem to do with Athens? Meaning, what has Jerusalem, the hometown, as it were, of Christianity, to do with Athens, the center of Greek intellectual life? The way he asked his question in the context implies that Tertullian thought they had nothing to do with one another and that Christians should avoid this pagan thought. In fact, he explicitly ridicules the study of the natural world. He says in one text, the Ad Nationes, that it served Thales of Miletus right to fall into that well while he was stargazing. Why does he say that? Well, let me read you what he says. He says, Thales' fall is a figurative picture of the philosophers, those, namely, who apply and are accustomed to apply their study to a vain purpose. For they feed a foolish curiosity on natural objects, which they should, instead, wisely direct to the creator of them. Now, Tertullian's real view was probably less extreme than this quotation implies. In his other works, he avails himself of standard methods of Greek logic and rhetoric, so clearly he himself knew the classical tradition. But even if we take Tertullian as the extreme example of trying to separate Greek thought from Christian thought, pagan thought from Christian thought, many other Christians disagreed with Tertullian. And let me mention two in particular. One of them is St. Justin Martyr, who was martyred at Rome sometime between 162 and 168. And the other is St. Clement of Alexandria, a teacher in a school, a Christian school in that very cosmopolitan city of the ancient world, Alexandria. Clement dies around 211, 215, somewhere in that area. Both of them argue that Greek thought and Christianity have many resonances. Both of them chose, in fact, one particular kind of classical thought, and that is Neoplatonism. For them, Neoplatonism was very close to Christianity. How is it close to Christianity? Well, they each say some very interesting things. Both of them would agree that truth can never oppose truth. If something is true, it's true, and it doesn't matter whether it comes from a pagan Greek, Plato, or out of the New Testament. Truth, all truth is God's truth. Now, Justin says that the pagans achieved part of the truth through the action of reason. And reason, for St. Justin, is a divine gift. Moreover, he uses the word logos constantly in this sense. Now, the Greek word logos is somewhat difficult to translate. It can mean simply word or argument or reason or proportion. It has a lot of meanings. But in Justin's usage, it's very clear what he's saying. He has in mind the first line, the opening line of the Gospel of St. John. En arche ein ho logos. In the beginning was the Word, meaning Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So what he's saying is, by saying that the pagans achieved some knowledge through the Logos, he's saying that in a sense, God made a revelation to them as well of Christ through reason. St. Clement, on the other hand, says that the pagans have torn off a piece of the truth. They have a piece of it, and we Christians have a piece of it. And he suggests that if you take those pieces and put them together, then you'll have even more of the truth. So very beautiful imagery is being used here. Well, aside from Justin and Clement, the really important character in outlining the Christian Church's early views towards pagan philosophy and natural philosophy, which is what we're particularly interested in, it was St. Augustine of Hippo. Now, St. Augustine was born in 354 in Tagaste in North Africa. It's now part of Tunisia. He lived for a while, grew up in North Africa, traveled to Italy, to Rome and Milan, then back to North Africa, where, much against his will, he was made Bishop of Hippo, and he filled that role until his death in 430. Now, St. Augustine wrote an enormous amount. You can easily fill up your bookshelves with the writings of St. Augustine. They fill up a huge amount of space. They were carefully read throughout the Middle Ages and are carefully read by theologians even down to the present day. In fact, much of Christian theology was developed by St. Augustine, by St. Augustine's thought. So he fits in a very select category of the 4 or 5 probably most important crafters of Christian theology, Christian thought. Now, what was his attitude towards the use of natural philosophy, towards the use of pagan philosophy in Christianity? Well, in some cases it's a little difficult to tell because sometimes he says things that seem slightly contradictory. Well, let's look at two things. Let's look at what he said and let's look at what he did. Let's begin with a particular work which is important for the history of science, and that is his De Genesi ad Litteram, literally a literal commentary on Genesis. It's a commentary on the first chapter of the book of Genesis, which deals with the creation of the world by God and the creation of everything in the world. Now, as it turns out, that first book of the chapter of Genesis would become an important location for the study of natural philosophy throughout the Middle Ages. Why? Well, it's the creation of the world and everything in it. So you've got cosmology, astronomy, botany, biology, meteorology, geology, physics, everything is there in that first chapter. And so we're going to spend an entire lecture later on just looking at interpretations during the High Latin Middle Ages of the first chapter of Genesis. Now, how does Augustine say you should interpret Scripture? Well, he posits 4 qualifications for a correct interpretation. 1, you have to be rational. The interpretations must be rational and reasonable. 2, they must be consistent. That is, you have to make the Bible consistent. If anything looks like a contradiction, you have to work that out. 3, you have to preserve the text. You may interpret it in allusive or allegorical fashions, but you have to preserve the text. And 4th, the most important for us, is your interpretations must be in accord with the current state of knowledge. That is very important for Augustine. In fact, one of his most widely quoted statements about this talks about how Christians can look foolish if they interpret the Scripture in a way that is not in accord with the knowledge of natural philosophy of science of the time. Here's his argument. He says, well, non-Christians generally know something about the planets, the stars, the earth, the mineral, animal, vegetable realm. And how do they know these things? Well, from reason and experience. They know them to be true. Therefore, what happens if a if a Christian is trying to expound Scripture, doesn't know these things, and says something that the pagans know is obviously wrong? Here's what he says. He says, "It is a disgraceful and a dangerous thing for one without the faith to hear a Christian talking nonsense on these topics when trying to give the meaning of Scripture." In other words, if a Christian is wrong on a simple matter of reason and experience, how will the pagans believe him when it comes to issues that are difficult, like the resurrection? Here's an example that Augustine uses. In one place in one of the Psalms, it says, God has stretched out the sky like a tent, or stretched out the sky like a skin, depending on how you translate it. Augustine says this may make you think that the sky is flat. He says, but of course we know that the universe is spherical. He gets this out of Greek philosophy. And he says, so how do we accord the two? He says, well, if you take a skin and you make it into a ball and you blow it up, you'll stretch it out, but it will be spherical. So that must be the meaning of the Scripture. Don't be foolish and think that stretching has to make something flat. Think about how you can stretch it to make it round, spherical, the way natural philosophy says it is. The knowledge of nature, therefore, is necessary for interpretation. In fact, he goes a little bit further. He's very tentative with his interpretations of Scripture. He says, what I say seems reasonable, but it may not be actually the meaning of Scripture, and this will always have to be amended as our knowledge of the natural world changes. So our interpretation has to be responsive to what we know about the natural world through reason and experience. Now, I need to say a little something about what he means by literal interpretation of Genesis, because if anything, his interpretation is not what we call literal. For example, he denies that creation happens in 6 days. totally denies that a day means 24 hours. One of his simple arguments for this is, well, the sun is created on the fourth day. How did you know the first 3 days had passed if the sun is only created on the fourth? So here he's trying to be rational and consistent. In fact, he eventually comes along to say that creation happens in an instant, that God creates everything at one moment, some things actually and some things in potential. Guess where he gets that from, right? That's right out of Greek philosophy about action, actuality and potentiality. Some things are created, as he calls, as seeds that would develop. He's borrowing this from Stoic notions of seeds that God implants in the world so that over time they develop into the forms that we see at different times and places. But creation is instantaneous, not over 6 days. 6 days is merely a form of speech used in the text. This is very different from the modern interpretation of literal. If we look at modern biblical literalists, modern fundamentalist biblical literalists, they want to take the words exactly as they read. 6 24-hour periods for creation and so forth. Augustine's literalism is nothing like this at all. In fact, there's almost nothing like this throughout the Middle Ages. Now, we don't want to overdo it here. Augustine would not say that a knowledge of the natural world is absolutely essential to every Christian. No, in fact, this is part of the reason why his texts are hard to understand, or it's rather hard to understand what his actual views were. The average Christian in the street, if you will, needs to know the basics of the faith. And the basics of natural knowledge of science are not really important. They're irrelevant to such a person. However, an advanced Christian who's trying to do interpretation of Scripture, who's trying to generate an intellectual theology, does need to know these things. And I think perhaps we can get a handle on this by looking at Augustine's relationship with his mother, Monica. Now, I'm not going to suggest some kind of bizarre psychoanalytical study of Augustine and his mother. No, what I mean instead is that the two are prototypes of two kinds of Christians. And Augustine's own life, the effects of his own life, undoubtedly shaped his views towards classical learning. Augustine's mother, Monica, was a Christian, and her kind of piety was very simple, faith-based piety. Apparently, this was not enough for Augustine, because Augustine did not become a Christian. He turned his back on Christianity as a young man, joined the sect of the Manichees, a group of dualists who believed that all matter was evil and that there were two gods, a good one and an evil one, who were doing battle. He scoffed at much of Christianity because what he read, particularly in the Old Testament, seemed absurd to him. What he does then is he goes off, he becomes a teacher of rhetoric. He teaches in Carthage for a while, then he goes to Italy, goes to Rome, goes to Milan. In Milan, he hears the preaching of St. Ambrose. Now, St. Ambrose was at the center of a Neoplatonic school in Milan. And for the first time, Augustine now hears those seemingly bizarre and incomprehensible and even to his mind stupid stories out of the Old Testament interpreted in an allegorical fashion. And suddenly he has the realization that, wait a minute, there is an intellectual part to this Christianity stuff. We just have to figure out what it is. This was very important for Augustine, certainly. And eventually, after a long period of reflection, he becomes a Christian. If we read Augustine's Confessions, which is an autobiographical text that is both a confession of his sins and a confession of his faith, it's a very beautiful work, we see Augustine going around as if he's in a marketplace to all the different schools of pagan philosophy in the late antique period. He reads Aristotle, he reads the Epicureans, he reads the Stoics, he reads the Neoplatonists, he reads all kinds of people. In fact, as an autobiographical statement and as a historical document, it's probably one of our best views of what intellectual life in the late classical period, just before the fall of Rome, was like. The one thing I want to mention to you in particular is this. There are two places in the Confessions where Augustine has a sudden, immediate, intimate vision of God, mystical experiences, we may call them. And both of them come at a particular moment. One is alone and one is later with his mother. The interesting thing about it is, it doesn't come out of reading the Gospels. It doesn't come out of deep prayer. It comes after reading Plato. He tries to follow the Platonic ascent to the one good, true, and beautiful, and has a vision of the Christian God. Now, this must be a very impressive moment for Augustine, that he realizes the innermost hidden truths of Christianity through Neoplatonic writings. So, undoubtedly, he always had this in mind. Nonetheless, his mother, Monica, is a good woman. She loves him dearly. She's a good Christian. Her piety is a simple variety, though. And so, perhaps looking at both the Augustines and the Monicas of the world, which Augustine had to do as bishop in Hippo, he generates a sort of two-track or two-tier or multi-tiered system, whatever you want to call it. Science is not absolutely essential. Pagan philosophy is not essential for a Christian. A Christian can be a good Christian quite without it. But it helps. For those who are ready for it, who are willing to devote the time to it, it helps. Let me just say one last thing about Augustine and Plato. Augustine's synthesis for theology is really a synthesis between Christian thought and Neoplatonic philosophy, and that's what much of his theology is about. We see this very beautifully and clearly in his homilies given on the Gospel of John. Again, that first line, in the beginning was the Word. He gives his explication. I should mention first that his homilies of John, it's a huge book, one verse per homily pretty much. He tries to expound this. And he says, well, what does it mean that through whom all things were made? What does that mean? Everything was created through Christ. And what do you suppose he uses as an example? He says, well, let's say a carpenter wants to build a table. He has in his mind first the idea of the table, and then he constructs the table based upon that. It's Neoplatonized Aristotle. It's the Platonic ideas. It's the formal cause. And what does he relate that to? Jesus Christ. The second person of the Trinity becomes conflated with the Platonic ideas, those eternal forms by which the demiurge made creation. The demiurge looks at the forms, creates the world. God the Father, in union with God the Son, creates the world through God the Son. So a clear synthesis of the two. All right, well now let's go on to look at, in a practical sense, how the Christian church needed classical learning. Well, first of all, Christianity has a book. It depends upon scriptures. So you need verbal arts in order to interpret the scripture properly, in order to preach, in order to involve yourself with dialectic and apologetics. So the trivium, the Roman trivium of logic, grammar, and rhetoric are important for Christians. What about the quadrivium, the mathematical arts? Well, they turn out to be important too. Arithmetic is certainly necessary for accounting, and as the Christian church gets larger and larger, it needs to have an accounting of its members. It needs to keep account books of various sorts, so counting is certainly important. Geometry. Church has to build buildings eventually, right? And geometry is absolutely necessary for architecture, so geometry is important as well. Music, well, clearly, church music, important part from the very earliest days of Christianity. But the fourth topic of the quadrivium, astronomy, turns out to be even more important. Why on earth is astronomy important to Christians? Well, two reasons. One is once the monastic orders get started, they have specific hours of prayer. So you have to have timekeeping. How do you tell time when you don't have electric clocks or mechanical clocks for that matter? Well, you can try using water clocks. They tend not to work particularly well and they're hard to maintain. Instead, no, you look at the regular motions of the planetary or the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars. And we find a lot of early monastic writings saying, well, at this time of the year when this star rises, it's time to sing lauds. It's time to sing prime. There's one more important thing, though, and that is the problem of trying to fix the most important holiday of the Christian year. And that is, of course, Easter. Now, you may have noticed when you look at your calendar, you're never quite sure where Easter is going to fall. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there was a lot of argument about how to calculate the date of Easter. Well, the Council of Nicaea, which was convened by the Emperor Constantine in 325, made a ruling on this, that Easter would be celebrated on the first Sunday, following the first full moon, following the vernal equinox, the first day of spring. Well, how do you know when it's a full moon? Just look, right? You wait until there's a full moon, the first full moon of spring, you say, next Sunday is Easter. Well, that's not going to do you very much good. You need to know Easter well in advance because there are 40 days of Lent in preparation for Easter. So you have to be able to calculate the date of Easter months in advance to get ready. This meant that the church had to develop something called the computus, which was a method of calculating the date of Easter. It means you need to know something about the lunar cycle, you need to know something about the solar year. It turned out to be very complicated, and it is the one problem that dogs Christianity, bothers the hierarchy of the Christian church for over 1,500 years, getting Easter right. We'll talk a lot more about that. Well, let me just sum up now what we've come to. The attitude towards scientific knowledge in the early church is often summed up by saying that natural philosophy should be an ancilla, that is, a handmaiden to theology, to the practice of religion. That is, it's put in a subservient role, it serves the greater mistress, that is theology and religion. Now, some people might say that, oh, well, that sounds awful, that here you're demeaning the study of the natural world, the study of the natural sciences, to the status of a servant. Well, is that really bad? Is that really different? Is that really unusual? In fact, if we compare it to the status that natural philosophy had in the ancient world, it's quite similar. Remember that Plato wanted us to study the natural world. Why? Not just to find out about the way the heavens move, but because the contemplation of how the heavens move changes us. That's the Platonic idea, that knowledge is transformative of the knower. And so really it's about us. It's about making us better, more perfect beings. That's why we know about the that's why we know about the classical world, that's why we know about the natural world. How about today? Is science without a master or a mistress now? Well, in most cases, probably not. A lot of scientific research is done in corporations. There, the mistress is the dollar. And so science is used to make money, not for its own good. The corporations don't say, oh, don't we feel wonderful? We've learned something about the natural world. No, we've discovered something we can make money off of. Right? Even, let's say in medicine, we don't learn about the actions of the body just to know about the internal anatomy or functions of the human body, as interesting as it is. Often, that's directed towards a practical goal, medicine, towards healing people. So in fact, science almost always has a master or a mistress, depending on how you want to personify it. Well, now, we're going to take our leave of the Latin world for a while and head eastward to study a new world power that would arise about 200 years after Augustine's death, and that is Islam. While the Christian West was struggling to overcome the collapse of the Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions, Islam flourished as a great and advanced civilization. And in fact, as great and as advanced as the Islamic civilization of the Middle Ages was, we still know not very much about it today, not even just among the general public, but even among historians of science. It's still a great area of research to be studied. And I think you'll be very interested to find out some of the things that happened in the Islamic world in terms of the history of science.